The midwife who delivered the master's son in 1841, and whispered 3 words that cursed his under the suffocating heat of a southern summer in 1841. A silence hung over the plantation like a curse waiting to be spoken. The fields shimmered beneath the sun, yet the mansion's corridors were cold, untouched by mercy. In that house of polished wood and hidden rot, life began and ended on the same breath. They said every cry of a newborn echoed the sins of its father. And on one sweltering August night, a midwife named Eliza came to deliver a child who was never meant to live free. Eliza was known across the county not just for her hands, but for her silence. She had brought hundreds of children into a world that never wanted them, yet no one could recall her ever shedding a tear. But that night, when the master's wife screamed from her bed and the house filled with the smell of sweat and fear, Eliza felt something shift deep inside her chest. She knew this delivery would not be like the others. The master's son had been conceived in sin. Everyone knew it. Whispers among the enslaved spoke of a woman taken from the quarters, her cries swallowed by the night, her name erased from memory. The mistress demanded a child, and the master gave her one, though the bloodline was already stained. Eliza, bound by duty and dread, stood between 2 worlds, the oppressors who owned her life, and the woman whose spirit still haunted the shadows of the birthing room. As the child's cries filled the air, something in Eliza's soul cracked. She looked into the infant's pale face and saw not innocence, but inheritance. The air thickened with an unseen weight. The master's wife lay pale and trembling, her eyes rolling back as if she could already see her fate. Eliza leaned close to the newborn, her lips trembling, and whispered 3 words that no one in that house ever forgot. From that moment, strange things began to happen. Lamps flickered when the baby cried. The family dog refused to enter the nursery. Servants whispered that the cradle moved on its own at night. The master dismissed it all as superstition until the first tragedy struck. But the truth, buried beneath decades of silence and sealed letters, would not stay hidden forever. The story of that night would travel through generations, whispered in the dark by those who knew the curse was real. Because sometimes history isn't tea written in ink, it is carved into the bones of those who dared to speak. And if you think you've heard every dark tale of the Old South, think again. Before this story ends, you'll uncover what those 3 words were, and why no one who heard them ever lived in peace again. Stay with me until the end, because the final revelation is something only the brave can bear to hear. The year was 1841, a time when the world seemed divided by invisible lines drawn in blood and silence. In the Deep South, cotton ruled as king, but behind its white fields stretched an empire built on human suffering. The plantation of Hollow Creek stood like a monument to that cruelty, its grand facade masking generations of grief. By day, the air carried the rhythmic sound of blades cutting through cane. By night, it carried whispers that refused to die. The mansion itself was a paradox. Ornate, with tall white columns and chandeliers imported from France, yet beneath its floors ran a labyrinth of tunnels where secrets were buried alongside the dead. Some said they were escape routes from an older war. Others claimed they were built to hide sins too great to confess. Whatever their purpose, the tunnels beneath Hollow Creek were colder than any grave, and those who entered rarely returned unchanged. The master of the house, Jonathan Beauregard, was a man born into privilege and polished hatred. His name carried weight in every parish court, but his conscience carried ghosts. Locals swore that storms gathered whenever he raised his voice, that the heavens themselves recoiled at his cruelty. His wife, Eleanor, frail and pale as porcelain, lived mostly behind locked doors, her mind consumed by grief and morphine. Servants whispered that she saw shadows moving in the mirrors and heard a woman's lullaby in the nursery long after midnight. And then there was Eliza, the midwife. She had lived her entire life between the rows of sugarcane, delivering babies who would grow up in chains. No one remembered where she came from. Some said she had once been free, others that she had been traded from plantation to plantation for her skill. What everyone agreed upon was that her hands were steady, her eyes knowing, and her silence heavier than any sermon. Outside the plantation walls, America was a country tearing at its seams. Abolitionists in the North called for freedom. Bounty hunters in the South hunted flesh as if it were currency. The word justice meant nothing here, only survival, and within that fragile balance, the smallest act of defiance could ignite a curse that would echo through centuries. When Eliza arrived at Hollow Creek that fateful summer, the sky was a sheet of molten copper. A storm was coming, though no one knew whether it was of nature or retribution. She was led through long corridors lined with oil portraits whose painted eyes seemed to follow her every move. The air smelled of camphor and decay. Somewhere upstairs, a woman's moans intertwined with the slow ticking of a grandfather clock that hadn't chimed in years. Outside, the workers paused, sensing something unnatural. The fields fell silent. Even the cicadas stopped their song. They said later that the moment Eliza entered the house, the light changed, subtly, as if the sun itself hesitated. And in that stillness, every spirit bound to the land seemed to hold its breath. The old women of the quarters spoke of an ancient belief that when a birth takes place on cursed soil, the child carries not only the blood of its parents, but the weight of their sins. Hollow Creek was already drowning in unspoken wrongs, and that night would make it overflow. Down in the tunnels, a candle flickered to life. Some claimed it was the wind, others swore it was her. A shadow moved across the walls, pausing near the sealed door marked with the letters E.M., the initials of a woman long forgotten. And as thunder began to roll across the horizon, Eliza's footsteps echoed through the house, soft but certain, like someone walking toward destiny. The air grew thicker. The storm drew closer. No one in Hollow Creek could have known that the birth about to take place would shatter every illusion of control. But the land knew, the walls knew. And beneath the roots of the magnolia trees, something old and angry began to stir, waiting for the moment when 3 whispered words would change everything. Eliza had long stopped believing that birth was a miracle. To her, it was survival, raw, painful, and often short-lived. The enslaved women she helped were forced to bring life into a world that refused to see it as human. Every cry she heard was both a beginning and a warning. Yet, in that endless cycle of suffering, Eliza carried a strange sense of purpose. Her touch was steady, her words few, her eyes deep with a quiet defiance. They called her the one who listens, for she seemed to hear what others could not. The murmurs of the dying, the prayers of the unborn, the whispers of the earth itself. She had once been young and hopeful, a girl who believed that healing others could heal herself. But years under the sun and the lash had turned her hope into steel. Her back bore scars, her hands trembled when she was alone, yet her spirit refused to break. She had learned the ways of herbs and roots, the chants of the elders, and the language of the unseen. Some said she could speak to spirits, others said she carried one inside her. Only Eliza knew which was true. Jonathan Beauregard, the master of Hollow Creek, was a man carved from pride and power. He believed his lineage made him untouchable, his cruelty justified by God. But behind his eyes lurked fear, the fear of losing control. He watched his wife's mind unravel, his crops fail, his slaves whisper behind his back. To the world, he was the embodiment of authority. Within his home, he was a man haunted by guilt he dared not name. Eleanor, his wife, had once been the belle of Charleston, a vision of grace, poetry, and charm. Now she was a ghost draped in silk. The miscarriages had hollowed her from within. The morphine dulled her pain, but sharpened her visions. She claimed to see a woman standing at the foot of her bed, singing lullabies in a tongue no one understood. The servants crossed themselves when she spoke of it. Jonathan called it madness. Eliza knew better. There was also Samuel, a field hand, barely 20, whose quiet devotion to Eliza bordered on worship. He had watched her heal wounds others thought fatal, watched her face danger with the stillness of a saint. To him, she was more than human. She was a bridge between this world and the next, and though he rarely spoke, the way he looked at her carried both reverence and sorrow, as if he knew her fate was already written. Among the enslaved, stories of Eliza's power spread like wildfire. Some said she had once delivered a child born dead who later drew breath when she whispered to it. Others swore she could stop bleeding with a single word. Whether truth or myth, it made her both feared and revered. Mothers prayed she would be the one to bring their children into the world. Overseers whispered that her presence made the air feel strange. The night she was summoned to the big house, she felt a chill crawl down her spine. As Samuel handed her the worn leather bag of herbs and rags, he whispered, "Don't stay long, Miss Eliza. That house eats souls." She smiled faintly, but her eyes betrayed a knowing dread. For days she had dreamed of water turning red, of a cradle rocking by itself, of a voice calling her name from beneath the floorboards. Inside the mansion, Eleanor lay drenched in sweat, her breath shallow, her lips whispering words only she could hear. Jonathan stood beside her, his face a mask of impatience and fear. When Eliza entered the room, their eyes met, his full of command, hers full of quiet fire. In that moment, the balance of power shifted in a way neither understood. Eliza took Eleanor's trembling hand and whispered, "Hold on." But inside, she was speaking to something else, something older than both women, something that had waited too long for justice. And when the first cry echoed through the hall, it wasn't just a baby being born. It was a reckoning awakening, one heartbeat at a time. The storm broke the moment the baby's cry filled the air. Rain hammered against the shutters, wind howled through the cracks, and the old chandelier trembled above them as if reacting to a force unseen. Eliza wrapped the infant in a white linen cloth that quickly turned pink where blood seeped through. The child's skin was pale, too pale, and his eyes, when they opened, were the color of dark amber, almost golden. For a moment, Eliza froze. It was not the color that frightened her, but the way the baby stared, focused, aware, as though he recognized her. The master's wife, Eleanor, was barely conscious. Her fingers clutched the sheets, whispering a name over and over, one no one else in the room dared to repeat. The master paced near the window, his reflection blurred by lightning. "Is he breathing?" he demanded, his voice cracking through the tension. Eliza nodded silently, but something in her chest twisted. The room was heavy with more than humidity. It felt alive, as if the walls were listening. Then she heard it, a faint sound beneath the wailing storm. At first she thought it was the wind whistling through the cracks, but it was rhythmic. 3 soft knocks from beneath the floorboards. Eliza looked down, her heartbeat quickening. The others noticed nothing. The master was too absorbed in his pride. Eleanor had drifted into delirium. Only Eliza seemed aware that the house itself had stirred. The floorboards. She tried to ignore it, focusing instead on the child. But when she reached to wipe his forehead, she noticed something strange. A tiny birthmark just above his collarbone. 3 dark dots in the shape of a triangle. Her hand trembled. It was a mark she had seen once before, long ago, on a woman who had died screaming in childbirth. A woman whose spirit was said to haunt Hollow Creek still. The air grew colder. The lamps flickered. Somewhere down the hall, a door slammed shut on its own. Jonathan cursed, but Eliza's gaze remained fixed on the child's mark. Memory struck her like lightning. Years ago, when she was still new to the plantation, a young woman named Mary had been forced to bear the master's first bastard child. The baby had been born lifeless. Before she died, Mary had clutched Eliza's wrist and gasped, "He will be born again. You'll know him by 3 marks." Now those words returned with cruel clarity. Eliza whispered a prayer, her breath trembling. "Lord, protect the innocent," she murmured. But the words felt hollow, as though God had turned away from this place long ago. The thunder roared again, and the knocking beneath the floor repeated, 3 times, slow and deliberate. Jonathan turned toward her. "What are you staring at, woman?" he barked. Eliza looked up, masking her fear. "Nothing, sir," she said softly, though her voice quivered. She placed the child in his arms, and the instant the master's hands touched the infant, the baby stopped crying. Silence filled the room, thick and suffocating. For one heartbeat, even the storm seemed to pause. Then the child smiled, a slow, unnatural curl of the lips. Jonathan froze. His wife whimpered in her half-sleep, and Eliza felt it, something unseen tightening its grip around the house, something old and patient finally awakening. She backed away, her eyes flicking once more to the wooden floor where the knocks had come. The sound had stopped, but a thin crack now ran between the boards, dark and damp, as if the house itself had begun to bleed. Eliza clutched her bag to her chest and whispered under her breath, "She's here." From that moment on, the baby would not sleep unless he was held. And every night, as the wind passed through Hollow Creek, the same soft knocking returned, 3 times, always 3. The first sign that what had been born that night was not just a child, but a curse calling itself home. Days turned into weeks, and the mansion of Hollow Creek grew darker, though the sun still shone outside. The baby, named Thomas by his father, was treated like an heir to a kingdom built on pain. The master paraded him before guests as proof of his divine favor, never mentioning that his blood was mixed with that of the enslaved. Eliza watched from the shadows, her jaw tight, knowing the truth no one dared to speak, that the child's mother had not chosen to give him life, and her spirit had not chosen to rest. Eleanor, the mistress, was fading. She rarely left her room, clutching rosary beads that broke beneath her trembling fingers. Her eyes, once soft and blue, now stared through people as if she were looking into another world. Some nights she screamed until dawn, shouting that the woman in white stood beside the cradle, whispering lullabies that froze her blood. Jonathan silenced her with laudanum and denial, telling everyone she was unwell. But Eliza knew better. The dead had found a way to speak, and the living refused to listen. The injustice of Hollow Creek ran deeper than cruelty. It was systemic, inherited like a disease. Every life in the quarters existed only to sustain the comfort of the few who lived in the big house. When an enslaved child fell ill, no doctor came. But when Thomas coughed, 3 physicians arrived before sunset. When the workers begged for more rations, they were whipped. Yet every day barrels of fresh fruit and meat were wasted in the mansion kitchen. The difference between mercy and punishment was not law, it was skin. Eliza tried to keep her distance, but she couldn't. The baby cried endlessly unless she was near. The master demanded her presence day and night, claiming she was favored by Providence. Each time she held the child, the air grew heavy, almost electric, as if something unseen stirred around them. Once, when she sang an old spiritual under her breath to soothe him, the candles flickered and the cradle rocked without touch. The master called it coincidence. Eliza called it warning. The other servants began to fear her. Some avoided her gaze, others slipped charms of salt and iron outside her door. They whispered that she had brought the curse herself, that she de-angered the spirits by defying the natural order. But the truth was far crueler. The curse had been born from centuries of silence, from women whose cries had never been heard. Eliza had only given voice to what was already there. One afternoon, while cleaning the nursery, she noticed something strange. The cradle's underside had been scratched, deliberately. At first, she thought it was the baby's doing, until she realized the marks formed letters. She leaned closer, tracing the grooves with her fingertips. 3 words, faint but clear. He remembers her. Her breath caught. The letters were too precise for an infant's hand. Panic crawled up her spine as she whispered, "Who remembers?" But no answer came, only the slow creak of the rocking chair moving by itself. That night, Eleanor awoke screaming, claiming she had heard a woman's voice whisper those same words in her ear. Jonathan stormed out of their room, furious, shouting that Eliza's witch songs were poisoning his wife's mind. He forbade her from entering the nursery again. But bans meant nothing in Hollow Creek. The next morning, the baby refused to eat, refused to sleep, refused even to cry. His golden eyes stayed fixed on the door, as if waiting. When Eliza passed by in the hallway, his tiny hand reached through the bars of the cradle toward her, trembling. The moment she entered the room, he sighed, as though finally released from something unseen. Jonathan's rage turned inward, then outward. He punished the workers for imagined disobedience. He accused them of stealing, of murmuring curses, of plotting rebellion. Whips cracked, blood stained the earth, and still the cries from the nursery continued, soft, rhythmic, like the sound of a lullaby sung by a ghost. And through it all, Eliza began to understand. The curse was not vengeance, it was memory. The house itself was remembering every sin that had built it, and soon it would demand payment. It was on the 13th night after the ban that the house finally showed its true face. The air inside Hollow Creek had turned foul, thick with the smell of damp earth and something else, something old. Even the lamps seemed dimmer, as though afraid to burn too brightly. Eliza, forbidden to enter the nursery, sat awake in her quarters, the rain tapping at her window like impatient fingers. Then came the cry. It wasn't the wail of a hungry infant. It was sharper, desperate, almost human in its fear. She ran, barefoot through the dark halls, her candle flickering wildly as she pushed open the nursery door. The room was cold enough to make her breath visible. The cradle was empty. For a moment, everything was still. Then she saw them, tiny footprints smeared in blood, leading from the crib to the far wall. They stopped at the floorboards near the corner, where the first knocking had once been heard. "Eliza!" Eleanor's voice broke through the silence from the doorway. She stood trembling, her white nightgown clinging to her body, eyes wide with terror. "He's gone," she whispered. "He was sleeping, and then she took him." "She?" Eliza stepped forward slowly. "Who, Miss Eleanor?" "The woman in white," she said, "the one you hear singing." Eliza followed the trail of blood and pressed her ear against the floor. The sound returned, 3 knocks, deep and deliberate. Beneath her, something was moving. She grabbed a poker from the fireplace and pried at the boards until one gave way, revealing a narrow gap that exhaled a foul, cold breath. The smell of rot filled the air. She reached down with the candle, illuminating a small cavity lined with fabric scraps and something else. Bones. Tiny, fragile bones. Her heart clenched. There were several of them, arranged neatly as if laid to rest by loving hands. Beside them, a scrap of cloth embroidered with initials, E.M. Eliza's candle shook. "Mary," she whispered, the name of the woman who had died giving birth years before. Eleanor screamed, clutching her face. She said she would come for him. She said no child of his would ever draw a clean breath. The room erupted with noise, the wind rattling the shutters, the floorboards creaking, the chandelier trembling above them. The baby's cry echoed again, but it came from below, muffled by the earth. Jonathan burst into the room, his face red with fury. "What have you done, witch?" he roared, striking Eliza so hard she fell against the wall. The candle rolled across the floor, its flame flickering near the open gap. "You've brought this evil here." Eliza rose slowly, her cheek bleeding, her voice steady despite the trembling in her limbs. "I didn't bring it," she said. "You did, long before I came." He raised his hand again, but before he could strike, a violent gust of wind burst through the window, extinguishing the flame. The cradle began to rock by itself, faster and faster, until it slammed to a stop. From within the gap in the floor came a whisper, not a cry, but a woman's voice, low and clear. He remembers her. Jonathan froze. The color drained from his face. "That voice," he stammered. "It can't be." The sound grew louder, closer, as if the house itself were speaking through the walls. Eleanor collapsed to her knees, sobbing. "She's here. She's come for her son." Eliza reached into the hole and found something cold. A locket, its chain tangled in the bones. She opened it and gasped. Inside was a portrait of Mary, and Jonathan standing beside her. The truth hit her like thunder. The child born that night was not only the master's sin reborn, it was his own blood returned to demand what was stolen. The walls groaned, a long, deep moan that made dust fall from the ceiling. The floorboards beneath them shifted, widening the crack. The knocking began again, 3, then 6, then 9 times, faster and faster, like a heartbeat rising to a scream. Eleanor fainted. Jonathan stumbled back, his bravado gone, his eyes wide with terror. Eliza clutched the locket in her fist, whispering the old words her grandmother had once taught her to calm restless souls. But it was too late. The air had changed, the curse had fully awakened, and Hollow Creek was no longer just a house. It was a graveyard that remembered every injustice buried within its walls. The night did not end. It stretched on endlessly. The house trapped in a twilight that refused to fade. Eliza carried the locket pressed to her chest as thunder rumbled outside, though no lightning split the sky. The storm had moved inside now, crawling through the walls, whispering in every corner. The baby was found just before dawn, alive, sleeping peacefully at the foot of Eleanor's bed, wrapped in the same blood-stained linen. Yet his eyes were open, watching, waiting. Jonathan, shaken but unwilling to face the truth, ordered the floorboards resealed. "No one speaks of this," he said, his voice cracking like a whip. "Not to the servants, not to the priest, not to anyone." He turned to Eliza. "You will stay away from this house. If you come near my family again, I'll have you flogged and hanged." Eliza said nothing. Her silence was not submission, it was judgment. She knew the curse could not be silenced with nails and wood. What had been buried would rise again, just as it always did. 2 days later, strange things began to happen. The milk soured in its pails. The livestock refused to enter their pens. Every clock in the mansion stopped at the same hour. 3:03 a.m., the moment the knocking had begun. The servants whispered that the spirit of Mary was walking the halls again, searching for her child. Jonathan's fury grew with his fear. He ordered the tunnels under Hollow Creek sealed forever, claiming they were the source of evil. Workers were sent to wall them up, their torches flickering as they descended into the cold earth. But one man never returned. When the others found him hours later, his face was pale as ash, his eyes wide open, and carved into the skin of his chest were 3 words: "She is below." That night, Eleanor began speaking in her sleep. Her voice was soft, but not her own. She called for Eliza, repeating the same phrase again and again: "She waits beneath." When Eliza came to check on her, she found the locket she'd hidden now resting on Eleanor's pillow, its chain twisted like a noose. Inside, the portrait had changed. Jonathan's face was gone, replaced by a dark smudge, as if erased by invisible hands. Eliza's heart pounded. She had heard of such things before, the living marked by the dead, trapped in a loop of guilt and remembrance. But there was something different here. The curse was not just haunting the master's bloodline, it was rewriting it. In the days that followed, the baby grew stronger, though his skin seemed to pale further, his eyes glowing faintly in candlelight. Once, when Eleanor tried to sing to him, he began to hum a tune she did not know. A lullaby the enslaved women used to sing in the fields, the same one Mary had sung before her death. The sound was soft, almost tender, but every candle in the room burned blue. Eliza began to suspect a truth more terrifying than anything she had imagined. What if the curse was not vengeance, but reclamation? What if the child was not only born under a curse, but as its vessel? That night, she returned to the nursery, ignoring the master's orders. The air was thick with the scent of myrrh and decay. The cradle stood still, yet when she approached, she saw a small bundle hidden beneath it, something wrapped in cloth. She knelt and pulled it out. Inside was a journal bound in cracked leather. Its cover bore the initials J. B. Her hands trembled as she opened it. The first page read, Confession of Jonathan Beauregard, 1834. And beneath the ink, faded and trembling, were the words that would change everything. The midwife was right. I heard her curse, and I know it was meant for me. Eliza stared at the page as the baby stirred, a soft whimper escaping his lips. The wind outside began to rise again, whispering through the cracks of the room, as if repeating the words written in the journal. And as the last candle went out, she realized the curse had never been about revenge. It was about truth, demanding to be told. Eliza spent the following day hidden in the servants' quarters, the journal clutched tightly against her chest. The walls of Hollow Creek groaned as though restless, and the air itself seemed to hum with a low electric charge. She could not shake the feeling that the house was listening, that every secret whispered inside its walls had become part of its living, breathing memory. When she finally dared to open the book again, she discovered that Jonathan's handwriting changed as the pages went on, as if his sanity had unraveled along with his lies. The first entries were typical of a proud man, records of crops, debts, and slaves, all listed like possessions. But deeper within the journal, the tone darkened. The child was not stillborn. One entry read, Eliza said she felt the pulse, but I told her to bury him. I could not allow the world to know. Her hands trembled as she turned the page. There were more, pages describing a secret burial beneath the nursery, the same place where she had found the tiny bones. Jonathan had not buried one child, he had buried several. Eliza's stomach turned. The 3 small skeletons beneath the floor had not been there by chance. They were the children of women taken by force, their lives erased to protect the master's name, and the initials EM, embroidered on the cloth, Mary's, were not a mark of mourning, but of defiance. She had sewn her name into the shroud so that one day someone would find it. Outside, thunder rolled like a drumbeat. Eliza looked toward the nursery, its door slightly ajar. Inside, the baby slept soundly, his tiny chest rising and falling. Yet as she watched, his lips moved, murmuring something she could not hear. She stepped closer. The words became clearer, and her blood ran cold. The baby was repeating fragments from the journal, phrases Jonathan had written in his own hand. Eliza buried him. The earth remembers, the child whispered, voice soft as wind. Her heart pounded. She backed away, nearly tripping over the threshold. Somewhere in the distance, the grandfather clock struck 3, though no one had wound it in years. That evening, Samuel returned from the fields with news that the tunnels had been fully sealed. No more digging, he said, his face pale, but they say when the last brick was set, the walls started crying, water thick like blood. Eliza knew then that it was too late to contain what had been awakened. The curse had roots older than the house itself. Hollow Creek was built atop stolen land, watered by blood, its foundation laid by the bones of the enslaved. Each secret buried here had become part of the soil, and now the soil was remembering. Unable to resist, she returned once more to the nursery after dark. The baby was awake, eyes glowing faintly in the candlelight. On the table beside the cradle lay the journal, open to a page she had not turned. The ink was fresh, glistening as if newly written. The words formed slowly, before her eyes. "He is not mine. He is hers." Her breath caught. "Mary," she whispered. The candle flickered violently, then went out. The cradle began to sway, slow and deliberate, though no wind moved in the room. From the shadows, a voice rose, low, melodic and unbearably sad. It was the lullaby. When the light returned, Eliza saw something impossible. The portrait on the wall, the Beauregard family painting, had changed. Jonathan's figure had dark stains creeping up his chest, his painted eyes now hollow. Beside him, where the mistress once held the child, a new shape appeared, a woman in white, her hand resting protectively over the baby's heart. Eliza stumbled backward, her hand covering her mouth. The woman's face was unmistakable. It was Mary. The floor beneath her feet pulsed once, twice, then split slightly along the same crack near the crib. The faint sound of a heartbeat echoed through the boards, and from within came that same rhythmic knocking. 3 beats, a pause, then 3 more. Eliza understood at last. The curse wasn't bound to the dead. It was carried by the living. The child wasn't possessed. He was the vessel through which every buried truth demanded to be seen. As she whispered a prayer for mercy, the baby's eyes lifted toward hers, and he smiled, a gentle, almost knowing smile. "Mama," he murmured, though no one had ever taught him the word. And in that moment, Eliza realized the most horrifying truth of all. The curse was not meant for Jonathan alone. It was meant for anyone who kept silent while evil reigned. Hollow Creek would remember every voice that stayed quiet. The storm broke over Hollow Creek like a judgment long delayed. The sky split open with thunder as rain fell in torrents, turning the red clay of the plantation into rivers of blood-colored mud. Eliza ran through the halls, clutching the crying infant, her breath shallow and broken. The house groaned as if alive, its shutters slamming and floorboards heaving under invisible weight. Every portrait along the corridor seemed to watch her pass, the eyes of the dead Beauregards gleaming faintly in the candlelight. She burst into the master's study, where the journal still lay open on the desk, its pages fluttering though there was no breeze. A drop of water struck the ink, and the words bled across the page until they formed a new sentence that hadn't been there before. "The son shall bear the name of the sin." Eliza froze. She looked down at the child in her arms, his eyes wide and unblinking. "What are you?" she whispered, voice trembling. The baby's gaze shifted toward the portrait above the fireplace, Jonathan Beauregard in all his proud, cruel glory, and then back to her. The crying stopped. The room fell silent. Behind her, the door creaked open. Samuel stood there, soaked and pale, his hands shaking. "Eliza," he said hoarsely, "the tunnel, they're open again." "What do you mean?" she demanded. "The bricks, they've fallen. I saw it with my own eyes, and there's light coming from below. Not fire, not lanterns, something else." Before she could respond, the walls shuddered. From the floor below came a low, guttural moan, a sound like the earth itself grieving. The candle flames bent sideways, drawn toward the center of the room where the rug began to ripple. The boards beneath it warped, splitting along the grain. The faint sound of whispering rose through the cracks, hundreds of voices murmuring the same phrase over and over, their tone a mix of sorrow and accusation. She said 3 words. Eliza dropped to her knees, pressing her hand to the floor. "What words?" she cried out. "Tell me." The voices grew louder until the air vibrated with them. The baby began to wail again, his tiny body trembling in her arms. Then, as lightning illuminated the study, she saw it, carved into the underside of the rug, scratched by hand into the wood. 3 faint words, barely legible beneath the dust and time. "He is mine." Eliza's heart stopped. Samuel staggered backward. "That's Mary's hand," he whispered. "I've seen her stitching before. She carved that herself." The realization struck Eliza like a blow. Mary's curse wasn't a malediction, it was a claim. The child Jonathan had taken for his own, the baby he'd buried in shame, had never been his to claim. He had forced life into the world through violence, but the spirit that emerged belonged to Mary. Her love, her suffering, her vengeance, all had been bound into the bloodline that continued in silence. Every generation since had carried a fragment of her rage. Thunder cracked so loudly the glass shattered. Eliza clutched the infant tighter as the journal flew open again, its pages flipping until they stopped on one final entry, one dated the very night Mary died. The handwriting was frantic, almost desperate. "Mary." She said the words before she bled out. "I thought it a mother's madness, but the cradle shook. The light dimmed, the earth moved. I burned her body, but the air would not forget. God forgive me. She said he would never rest, nor I." The baby's cry deepened, becoming something impossible, older, heavier, like 2 voices merging. His small hands reached toward the portrait above the fire. The painted image of Jonathan began to smoke. The canvas bubbled, and then the man's face twisted, melting as though under invisible heat. From within the layers of paint another face emerged, a woman's, eyes burning with grief and fire. Mary. "Eliza!" Samuel shouted. "The tunnels!" The floor gave way beneath them. Eliza fell, clutching the child as they plunged into darkness. They landed in the old brick chamber where she had first found the bones. But it was no longer empty. Figures stood along the walls, shadows shaped like people, dozens of them, men, women, children. Their faces were pale as ash, their eyes glowing faintly blue. One stepped forward, the unmistakable shape of Mary. Her dress floated as though under water, her hair matted with blood, yet her expression was not vengeful. It was mournful. She raised her hand, pointing to the infant. "Yours," Eliza whispered through tears. "He's yours." Mary's lips moved without sound, but Eliza heard the words in her mind. "He carries us." At that, the baby stopped crying. The walls of the chamber pulsed with faint light, illuminating words scrawled into the brick, names, hundreds of them, each belonging to the enslaved souls who had died on the land. Their voices rose together, not in rage, but in release. The sound was like a great sigh after centuries of pain. As the ground trembled, Samuel fell to his knees. "They're leaving," he said in awe. "They're finally leaving." The light swelled, filling the tunnels, the house, the fields above. Every trace of Hollow Creek's cruelty, its walls, its symbols, its foundations, began to crumble, turning to dust, and in the center of it all, Eliza held the child who was both curse and redemption, the living embodiment of every silenced truth. When dawn came, Hollow Creek was gone. Only the chimney remained, jutting from the earth like a monument. Eliza stood beside it, the baby quiet against her shoulder. The storm had passed, but the ground still hummed faintly beneath her feet, as if the land itself was breathing again. She looked down at the infant. His eyes were no longer blue, but a deep brown, soft and human. "You're free now," she whispered. But somewhere, faint and distant, came the echo of a lullaby. The same song Mary had once sung in the darkness, carrying through time, through blood, through curse. A reminder that though peace had been found, the memory would never fade. When the dust finally settled over what had once been Hollow Creek, silence reclaimed the land. The sun rose timidly through the mist, revealing the ruin of a world built on cruelty. The mansion was gone, its ashes scattered into the soil that had once been soaked with sweat and blood. Only the old chimney stood, blackened and hollow, a gravestone for the living and the dead alike. Eliza stood before it, her dress torn, her hands still trembling from what she had witnessed. The child slept against her chest, his small breath warm against the morning air. She could still feel the hum of the earth beneath her feet, the faint echo of the voices that had risen from the tunnels. They were quiet now, not gone, but resting. For the first time in generations, the land itself seemed at peace. She thought of Mary, of her strength, her rage, her unbearable love. A woman enslaved, stripped of everything, yet powerful enough to shake the heavens. Her curse had not been born from evil, but from sorrow too heavy to bear, from a truth too long denied. And in the end, that truth had done what no whip, no prayer, no man could ever do. It had freed them. Eliza turned her gaze toward the fields, where the first rays of light caught on the dew. Once, those same fields had been places of torment. Now, they looked almost holy. She realized that every generation had lived under a kind of curse, not just the Beauregards, but everyone who chose silence over justice. Hollow Creek was not an exception, it was a reflection. The curse was history itself, repeating until someone dared to confront it. The wind carried the scent of magnolia and ash. In that fragile balance between destruction and renewal, Eliza felt something shift inside her. She understood now that the curse's true power was not in vengeance, but remembrance. It had forced the truth into daylight, demanded that the forgotten be named, and the crimes confessed. That was how healing began, not through denial, but through acknowledgement. As she walked toward the road, she passed what remained of the old gate. The sign that once bore the Beauregard name now lay broken in two. She stopped for a moment, placing her hand upon it. "Names matter," she whispered, "but so do the ones we never learned." The child stirred in her arms. For a moment, his eyes opened, and she saw no trace of the storm that had surrounded his birth, only calm and something ancient yet new. She knew he would grow up never knowing the weight of chains, but still carrying the memory of those who did. He was living proof that even the darkest legacies could give way to light if someone was brave enough to remember. In time, people would come to the ruins of Hollow Creek and speak of it as a haunting, a legend, a ghost story whispered to frightened children. But Eliza knew better. It wasn't a ghost that haunted this place. It was history. The kind that lingers not to scare but to teach. Because every curse, she realized, begins as a warning ignored. And every redemption begins the same way, when someone finally decides to listen. If you've made it this far, you already know. This was never just a ghost story. It was a reckoning. The curse of Hollow Creek wasn't cast by magic, but by memory. It was born from truth buried too deep and pain ignored for too long. And sometimes the scariest thing about history isn't what's supernatural. It's how real it actually was. But here's something most people will miss. The curse didn't die when the house fell. They say that on nights when the fog rolls over the old Beauregard land, you can still hear a woman singing, a lullaby carried on the wind. Some claim it's just the trees, others say it's the sound of peace. What do you think? Do you believe Mary finally found rest, or is her spirit still waiting for justice that history has yet to give? Type your answer below. Tell me, if you heard that song in the distance, would you follow it? Or would you turn away, afraid of what truth might be waiting on the other side? And remember what I promised at the beginning, the bonus revelation. Here it is. Historians did return to that land in the 1920s. Beneath the overgrown roots, they found the remains of an old brick tunnel and fragments of burned pages from a journal. The only legible line left said, "He will carry our names." Now I want to know what you think that meant. Was the child really free, or was he destined to bear the weight of those souls forever? Type your theory in the comments below. I read every single one, and some of your insights end up shaping the next story. And if you want to keep uncovering dark, forgotten corners of history, the ones that make you question what you thought you knew, then make sure you subscribe. Hit the bell so you never miss the moment truth breaks through the darkness, because the next story might not just haunt you. It might change the way you see the past forever. The sun had fully risen over Hollow Creek, burning away the last wisps of fog. The land was quiet now, too quiet. The kind of silence that only comes after centuries of screaming have finally stopped. Eliza stood for one last time beside the broken chimney, the only remnant of a house that had once held so much cruelty and sorrow. She looked down at the child in her arms, and for a moment she thought she saw the faintest glimmer of light in his eyes. Warm, human, alive. History, she realized, never truly ends. It lingers, reshaping itself through those who survive to tell it. The curse of Hollow Creek wasn't destroyed, it was transformed. What had once been vengeance had become remembrance, and remembrance was its own kind of justice. As she walked away down the dirt road, the morning wind brushed through the grass, carrying with it a sound she almost didn't recognize, a soft hum like a lullaby. Not haunting this time, but peaceful. It was as if the land itself was breathing again. For the first time in generations, the soil of Hollow Creek belonged to no master. It belonged to memory. And yet, centuries later, travelers passing through that same region still speak of strange things. A field that never grows wildflowers, a faint melody heard at dawn when the mist is low and the air feels heavy. Some say it's only the wind. Others whisper it is the echo of a promise that can't be broken, that as long as injustice exists anywhere, the voices of Hollow Creek will never truly rest. If you've stayed with this story until now, you've done more than listen. You've witnessed. And that matters, because every story like this one carries a hidden thread that binds us all, a reminder that the past doesn't vanish simply because we choose to forget it. It waits beneath the surface, patient and silent, until someone dares to dig it up again. But before you go, remember this. History keeps its secrets well, and some of them are closer than you think. Next time, we'll travel to another forgotten corner of the 19th century, to a seaside asylum where every patient swore they could hear a woman crying beneath the floorboards. For years, no one believed them until workers opened a sealed cellar and found something far more terrifying than anyone could have imagined. If you're ready for the next descent into the shadows of the past, stay close, because the story waiting there isn't just darker, it's true.